In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, one man's bravery would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What happened next was something no one could believe. In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, nature is both breathtaking and unforgiving. Towering snow-covered mountains rise against the sky, while dense forests stretch for miles, untouched and untamed. Rivers carve their way through the landscape, wild and fast-flowing, their icy waters carrying secrets of a world where survival is a daily battle. This is a place where human presence is merely a fleeting shadow, dwarfed by the power of the land and its creatures. John Marrow, a seasoned outdoorsman, knows this world intimately. With years of experience as a wildlife photographer and an unofficial rescuer of injured animals, John has lived in the wilderness for as long as he can remember. His cabin, nestled at the edge of a deep forested valley, stands as a solitary refuge against the harshness of the elements. He's familiar with the perils of this frozen world, yet today he's about to face something he's never encountered before. The shrill crackle of his radio breaks the silence, an urgent call from the local ranger. A bear cub is stranded in a swollen river, trapped in the deadly grip of winter. John doesn't hesitate. The wilderness has called, and he must answer. John stood at the edge of his cabin, staring out into the violent snowstorm. The winds howled like wolves in the distance, and the air felt like it was cutting through his clothes. The radio crackled again, urging him to act quickly. A bear cub, stranded in the middle of a river, was fighting for its life in these unforgiving conditions. The temperature was plummeting rapidly, and the chances of survival for the tiny creature were slim. John's pulse quickened as the weight of the situation settled in. He knew the dangers, he'd seen them before, felt them firsthand. But he couldn't turn away. This was a life. The decision was made in an instant. He grabbed his thick winter coat, his boots, and his gear, bracing himself for the harsh journey ahead. Every step would be a battle against nature's fury, but he had no choice but to try. The trail to the river was treacherous. The winds whipped at his face as he trudged through deep snow, each step a struggle. Trees swayed dangerously, their branches heavy with the weight of snow. The storm was relentless, and the temperature was dropping so fast that his breath was turning to ice in his lungs. He moved with a sense of urgency, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing every moment was critical for the cub. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John reached the riverbank. The scene before him was harrowing. The cub, barely visible in the churning, icy water, was struggling with every ounce of its tiny strength. The current was swift and unforgiving, and it was clear the cub was losing the fight. Without hesitation, John plunged into the water, the cold instantly seizing his body. His muscles screamed in protest as the current tried to pull him under, but he pressed on, determined. He fought against the river, each stroke heavier than the last, until he reached the cub, which was on the brink of exhaustion. With a surge of strength, he hoisted the cub onto his chest, wrapping it in his arms. The cold gnawed at his bones, but he didn't care. With every ounce of energy, John pulled the cub from the water, holding it close to warm it with his own body heat. The storm raged around him, but his focus was singular. He had saved a life. As John began to make his way back across the icy terrain, the weight of the cub in his arms felt like both a victory and a burden. The storm whipped around him, blurring the world into a cold, white blur. But there was something else. Something deep in the silence that had settled around him. The snowstorm raged, but he felt a presence behind him, an energy that sent a chill deeper than the frost in the air. His instincts, honed over years of survival in the wild, screamed that something was wrong. The heavy sound of footsteps, slow yet deliberate, broke through the wind's howling. His heart skipped a beat. The snow was thick, the visibility almost non-existent, but there was no mistaking the thud of immense paws on the ground. The heavy breathing that followed was deep, guttural, and unmistakably animal. John's pulse quickened and his body tensed. He knew that sound all too well. It was a predator on the hunt. Out of the swirling snow and through the whiteout, a shadow began to take shape. John's breath caught in his throat as the figure emerged. The outline was enormous, almost as if the storm itself had given birth to a beast. The hulking shape of the mother bear, her massive frame covered in thick fur, stepped into view. Her eyes, wild and full of fury, locked onto the man holding her cub. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and John's heart hammered in his chest as he froze in place, instinctively holding the cub tighter against him. The mother's growl rumbled through the air, a deep, primal sound that seemed to vibrate the very earth beneath John's feet. It was clear that she was not here to simply observe. She was here to take back what was hers. The man's mind raced, but there was no time for thought, only action. He knew what he had to do, but there was no escaping the truth. The mother bear would not hesitate to protect her young. John's breath turned to mist as he stood perfectly still, the sound of the storm blurring everything except the deep growls and the pounding of his own heart. The primal standoff had begun. Every instinct told him to run, but he couldn't. He wouldn't leave the cub. The storm raged, but it was the bear's fury that now filled the air. The frigid air bit at John's skin, the sting of the cold seeping through his clothes, but it was nothing compared to the burning tension that filled the space between him and the massive mother bear. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, the steam rising in the air mixing with the snowflakes falling around him. The cub, still clutched tightly to his chest, felt warm despite the freezing conditions. But the reality of the situation was all too clear. This was no longer about the cub. This was a matter of survival. John's body was cold, his muscles sore from the fight against the river, but his heart raced, pounding like a drum in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, to flee the bear's wrath before it was too late. But he knew that there was nowhere to run. The forest was thick with snow, and the blizzard had swallowed every path. The bear was faster, stronger, and in her mind, the threat was undeniable. One wrong move, one false gesture, and John knew he would be just another part of nature's cruel cycle. The bear's growl rumbled louder now, each step heavy with intent. Her massive paws crushed the snow beneath her, and the primal force of her presence was enough to make John's breath catch. There was no doubt in his mind that she would kill him if it came to that. He had seen it before, wild animals that would stop at nothing to protect their young. The stories didn't prepare him for this moment, the one where the face of death stared him down. Suddenly, without warning, the bear lunged forward, her roar splitting the air. The sound was deafening, terrifying in its intensity, and John's body surged with adrenaline. He didn't move. He couldn't. His legs felt like lead. His mind raced, unsure if his survival instincts would be enough to carry him through this moment. The bear was closing the distance fast. Her eyes, bright and filled with fury, locked onto him. The man realized then that there was no escaping her wrath. There was only one choice left. His grip on the cub loosened, and he slowly lowered it to the ground, careful not to make any sudden motions. His hands went up, palms facing the bear, in a silent plea for peace. "Please." John's voice cracked, barely a whisper against the howling winds. The words felt futile, but they left his lips nonetheless, his only hope now resting on calming the raging creature before him. His heart pounded like thunder, but he remained still, not daring to move. Every part of him screamed to take cover, to run and find shelter, but this was a standoff, and retreat would only make things worse. The seconds felt like hours. The storm continued to rage, snowflakes swirling in the air, but the only thing John could focus on was the bear. Her eyes never left him, her nostrils flaring with each breath she took. The tension was thick enough to choke him. The quiet between the growls deafening. Time seemed to slow, every second stretching into an eternity. He stood motionless, his heart hammering in his chest, preparing for whatever would come next. Would the bear strike? Would she turn and leave him to die out here in the storm? Or, in a twist he could not have predicted, would she do something entirely different? The air was thick with tension, the storm raging around them as John stood frozen in place, his hands still raised in a silent gesture of peace. The bear's roar had subsided, but its anger had not. Her piercing eyes bore into him, and her massive frame seemed to swell in the cold, her every movement an embodiment of raw power and rage. He braced for impact, expecting the earth-shattering strike, his body ready to defend the cub with every ounce of strength he had left. But then, without warning, the bear paused. John's heart skipped a beat. The moment stretched on like an eternity. The bear's nostrils flared, and she took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she sniffed the air between them. She seemed to hesitate, as if torn between two instincts, the one to protect her cub and the one to understand the strange human who had risked his life to save it. John didn't dare move. He was holding his breath, unsure whether this pause would end in violence or something he couldn't even fathom. The sound of the wind howling through the trees felt distant now, the storm itself forgotten as he focused on the bear before him. The mother bear's gaze flickered between John and her cub. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her massive head, sniffing the small creature on the ground before her. The cub was weak, but it was alive, and that alone seemed to calm the bear for a moment. Her posture shifted, no longer aggressive. She stepped back, slowly but firmly, as if considering the strange human who had saved her young. John's breath caught. Was this a trick? Was she preparing for a final strike? But the bear did nothing of the sort. Instead, with a gentle nudge of her snout, she prodded the cub, urging it to rise to its feet. The cub, shivering but alive, slowly stirred, lifting its head with a dazed expression. The mother, now calmer, gave a soft grunt, her body language no longer threatening. And then, something remarkable happened. The bear, instead of lunging at John or showing any more signs of aggression, turned her gaze back to him. This time, it wasn't the fiery fury he had seen before. Her eyes softened, just for a moment, as if she understood that he was not her enemy. The wildness in her stare gave way to something different. A fleeting moment of recognition, of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Without another sound, the mother bear gave a final glance at John and her cub. Her enormous body turned, and she began to slowly make her way back into the storm. Her steps were measured and deliberate, no longer the rush of an animal about to strike, but the purposeful gait of a mother with her cub. As they disappeared into the snowstorm, John's heart still raced, but the danger had passed. The storm howled on, but the moment of tension had broken. John stood there in stunned silence, barely able to comprehend what had just transpired. The air around him felt oddly still, as though the wild had momentarily paused to show him something he would never forget. He had expected an attack, a battle to the death, but instead, the bear had made a choice, one that no human could have predicted. And in that moment, John felt an overwhelming sense of awe, not just for the bear's power, but for the unpredictable, mysterious nature of the wild. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in the face of imminent danger, there could be moments of unexpected understanding. As the storm began to lose its fury, John stood there, his breath visible in the cold air. The wind was no longer a violent force but a soft whisper through the trees, and the snow, which had been fiercely blowing moments ago, now drifted lazily to the ground. The roar of the wilderness had quieted, and for the first time in what felt like hours, John allowed himself to exhale. The immense tension that had gripped his chest released in a rush, but it left him feeling strangely hollow, as if the wild world around him had just shown him a side of itself he would never forget. He watched as the mother bear and her cub disappeared into the distance, the storm closing in around them like a curtain. It felt surreal, the entire sequence of events. He had been ready to fight for his life, to stand against the savage force of nature, but instead, he had witnessed an act of something deeper, an understanding between two creatures of the wild, one human and one bear. The fact that he was still standing there, alive, was almost too much to process. As he began the long journey back to his cabin, John's thoughts were far from his physical exhaustion. The wilderness had always been a place of danger and unpredictability, but this moment, this rare, unexpected exchange had given him an entirely new perspective on survival. It wasn't just about outlasting the storm or fending off danger. It was about the complex dance between instinct, compassion, and the unspoken bonds that existed even in the harshest environments. The wild didn't operate on human terms, he knew that. Yet somehow, in the midst of the chaos, there had been a kind of communication, a mother's love for her cub, the selflessness of a man who chose to save a life, the wildness of nature that could both terrify and awe. John's footsteps crunched softly in the snow as he walked back, his mind racing with the memories of that moment. Something had shifted inside him, something unspoken but undeniable. He wasn't just a man who had faced down a bear. He was someone who had shared a rare moment of understanding with the wilderness. and it had changed him. He could feel the weight of that change in every step he took, as though the forest itself had imparted a lesson he could never forget. The bond between mother and cub forged in the wild would forever stay with him, a reminder of the profound mysteries that nature could reveal when least expected. As John reached the warmth of his cabin, the storm finally relented, leaving only the soft rustling of wind through the trees as a reminder of its fury. The world around him was still almost serene, as though the wilderness itself was catching its breath. Inside, the crackle of the fire welcomed him, but his mind remained far from the comfort of the hearth. He couldn't shake the image of the mother bear's eyes, fierce yet understanding, and the way she had stepped back, leaving him with more questions than answers. The wild had shown him a side of itself that could not be explained, only experienced. The tension of the encounter had shifted something inside him, something that would linger far longer than the physical exhaustion or the memory of the storm. John had come to the wilderness seeking solitude, but what he found was something deeper, a connection, a shared moment of understanding, born of instinct and raw emotion. He had saved the cub, but in return, the wilderness had given him a gift, a deeper appreciation for the unpredictable, tender, and powerful forces that shaped the wild world he had chosen to call home. Thanks for watching my video. Like and subscribe my channel.